Welcome to WikiPodcast. Today we're embarking on the first part of our religion series. And it's a really fascinating exploration, the rise of monotheism.
It's a huge one.
Absolutely. We're diving deep into how the concept of one God really began. We're calling this one God Against the World, how monotheism began.
Catchy title.
We think so. We've got a lot of information today, mainly drawing from the Wikipedia entry on monotheism. It gives a pretty comprehensive overview.
It does, yeah. History, different forms, cultures, it's all in there.
Right. So our mission really is to navigate all that, pull out the key developments, and try to understand those initial sparks, the evolution of this whole idea.
And make it clear for you, the listener, especially if you're trying to get a handle on complex topics quickly.
Exactly. So where do we start? The definition seems like the logical place.
Definitely. We need to nail down what we actually mean by monotheism.
Okay.
So at its core, it's the belief that one God is the only God, or sometimes maybe the dominant one, the main one.
Right, the big cheese, so to speak.
Oh, kind of. And interestingly, the word itself, monotheism, it's not ancient. It was coined back in the 17th century.
Oh, really? That late?
Yeah, by Henry Moore. It comes from the Greek. Monos for single and theos for God.
Single God. Makes sense. But as we looked into it, it wasn't quite that simple, was it? There are these other terms floating around.
Crucial distinctions, like henotheism and monolatrism.
Right, those two. What's the key difference there? Because they sound kind of similar.
They do, but they're distinct. So henotheism is basically worshiping one particular god, but you're not denying that other gods exist or that they might be valid for other people.
Okay, like having a favorite deity in a pantheon.
Pretty much, yeah. You focus on yours, but acknowledge the others. Monolatrism, though, is a bit different. You might recognize many gods could exist, but you consistently worship only one specific god.
Okay, so it's more about the practice of worship.
Exactly. The focus of your worship is exclusive, even if your theology acknowledges others. The term monolatry, by the way, often gets linked to the scholar Julius Wellhausen.
Gotcha. So it's not just about believing in one god, but how that belief relates to other potential deities.
Precisely. And even within monotheism itself, there's another layer, this idea of narrow versus wide monotheism.
Right, I saw that. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. Narrow monotheism is, well, narrower. It's the belief that only one deity exists, full stop. Any others people talk about, not real. Illusions, maybe.
Okay. Strict exclusivity.
Exactly. Wide monotheism is a bit more accommodating. It holds that there is one supreme God, the ultimate one, but it allows for the existence of lesser divine beings.
Like aspects of the main god, or maybe angels, spirits.
Yeah, things like that. They might be seen as manifestations, intermediaries, servants, whatever, but the supremacy of the one is still key. We'll definitely see examples of both as we go.
Okay, that's a helpful framework. So this idea of one God in its various forms has a long history. Where do we see the earliest, maybe, hints of this kind of thinking?
Well, we can look pretty far back, actually. Into the late Bronze Age, there are some potential quasi-monotheistic claims.
Quasi-monotheistic, meaning sort of, but not quite.
Yeah, leaning that way. A really famous example is Akhenaten in ancient Egypt. That's the 14th century BCE.
The pharaoh who changed everything, briefly.
That's the one. His great hymn to the Aten being the sun disk really elevates it. The language is striking. It sounds very focused on a single divine power.
I remember reading a line from it, something like, "O sole God beside whom there is none." Sounds pretty monotheistic, doesn't it?
It absolutely does to our ears, yeah.
Oh.
But, and this is a big but among scholars, was it truly monotheism in the strictest sense? Or was it perhaps intense monolatry?
The distinction we just talked about. So worshipping only Aten, but maybe not denying other gods existed entirely?
That's the debate. He certainly pushed Aten to the absolute forefront, suppressing other cults. But did he fundamentally deny the existence of Amun-Ra and the others, or just their relevance and power? It's not crystal clear.
And didn't Egypt revert back pretty quickly after he died?
It did, yeah. The traditional polytheistic system was restored. So Atenism was this radical, fascinating period, but maybe more of an intense focus, a monolatrous phase, rather than a permanent shift to narrow monotheism for Egypt at that time.
Okay, interesting. Now, if we shift location and move forward a bit in time,
Yeah.
the material mentions South Asia, Iron Age, the Rig Veda.
Yes, the Rig Veda.
Yeah.
Especially the later parts, like the 10th book, which dates to the early Iron Age, you start seeing these philosophical explorations.
About a single reality.
Exactly. Notions of monolism, the idea that everything ultimately comes from a single underlying principle or reality. They call it Brahman.
So less about a single personal god, more about a single cosmic source.
Initially, yes. Hymns like the Nasadiya Sukta, it ponders the origin of everything, even questioning how the gods came to be, hinting at something more fundamental.
Right.
And later Hindu theology really developed this. You have this vast pantheon of gods, right? But often they're seen as different facets, different expressions of that one ultimate reality, Brahman.
Is that where that famous line comes from? Truth is one, but the sages call it by many names.
That's the one. Rig Veda 1.164.46. To what is one, sages give many a title. It perfectly captures that idea and underlying unity beneath the apparent diversity. So, monistic, definitely. Sometimes leaning towards wide monotheism in worship, but generally not the narrow kind.
Okay. And then there's ancient China, even earlier, right? Shang Dynasty.
Yeah, going back to at least 1766 BCE, potentially earlier, there was this focus on Shangdi, meaning above sovereign, or sometimes translated as God or Tian, heaven.
A supreme omnipotent force.
That seems to be the idea, yes. Shangdi or heaven was central. But similar to the Egyptian situation, it wasn't really monotheism as we'd strictly define it.
Why not?
Because alongside Shangdi, people also worshipped various lesser gods, nature spirits, ancestors. That whole complex system existed.
Yeah.
So Shangdi was supreme, but not utterly alone in the divine sphere.
More like a king of the gods, maybe.
Perhaps a bit like that, yeah. A very powerful central figure. But then later you get developments like Mohism around the 5th century BCE.
And that was different.
It seems to get much closer to what we might call true monotheism. Modzi, the founder, taught that heaven, Tian, was the supreme will, and lesser gods and spirits were essentially its agents, carrying out its commands.
Oh, so kind of like the Abrahamic idea of angels serving God.
Exactly. That's a good analogy. Modzi's writings, like The Will of Heaven, really emphasize this hierarchy with heaven at the absolute top, directing everything. It's a move towards a more singular, controlling divine will.
So across these very different cultures, Egypt, India, China, we're seeing these like independent movements towards a singular divine focus, even if they don't all arrive at the same place.
That's a great way to put it. Leaning towards it, experimenting with it, you might say.
Which brings us to a religion that often is cited as perhaps the first really clear example of monotheism, Zoroastrianism.
Ah, yes, Zoroastrianism. Originating with the prophet Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, probably around the 6th century BCE, maybe earlier. It's definitely a major contender.
Because of Ahura Mazda.
Precisely. Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, the maker of all. In Zoroastrian belief, Ahura Mazda is the one supreme uncreated god, the ultimate source of good.
And many scholars think this was maybe the first monotheistic religion.
It's often credited as such, yes. And there's a lot of discussion about its potential influence, especially on Judaism during the Second Temple period after the Babylonian exile when Jews were exposed to Persian culture.
But there's always that complication, isn't there? Arvan.
Angramenu, or Ahriman, yes. The destructive spirit, the source of evil. That's the big debate.
Right. If you have this powerful force of evil seemingly opposing the good God, is it still pure monotheism? Doesn't that sound more like dualism?
That is the crux of it. It definitely introduces a strong dualistic element. How independent and powerful is Ahriman? Is he an equal counterforce to Ahura Mazda?
What do Zoroastrians themselves generally say?
Well, the dominant view within the faith, and among many scholars, is that Ahura Mazda is still ultimately supreme. Ahriman is seen as a destructive force, maybe originating within creation, but not an uncreated, co-equal god. Ahura Mazda will eventually triumph.
So it's like monotheism with a very strong asterisk for dualism.
You could say that. It's complex. Some might classify it as monotheism, maybe a specific type ethical dualism within a monotheistic framework. Others lean more towards calling it dualistic. It highlights how these categories aren't always neat boxes.
Yeah, definitely blurring the lines. Okay, so after Zoroastrianism, we get to Judaism, especially post-exile. This seems like a really pivotal moment.
Absolutely pivotal. After the return from Babylon, late 6th century BCE onwards, Judaism really crystallizes its understanding of God as not just the only God, but a personal, ethical God, deeply involved with creation and humanity.
And this is where ethical monotheism comes in strongly.
Yes, this becomes absolutely central. The idea that morality, ethics, stems directly from this one God alone. His laws are seen as universal, unchanging. It's not just about believing in one God, but about the moral implications of that belief.
And this concept had huge implications down the line.
Immense. This idea of a single, personal, ethical God became foundational for Christianity and Islam as well. It's a defining feature of the Abrahamic faiths.
It's fascinating how philosophical ideas from Greece also seem to bubble up around the same time, touching on similar themes of unity.
Right. Even back in the 6th century BCE, roughly contemporary with some of these other developments, you had Greek thinkers, the early monists like Thales.
They weren't talking about gods the same way, though, were they?
Not exactly in a religious sense, no. They were searching for the arch, the single fundamental substance or principle underlying all of reality. Water for Thales, air for Anaximenes. It's a philosophical move towards unity.
A unified explanation for everything.
Exactly. And then later, you get philosophers like Xenophanes of Colophon. He was quite critical of the traditional Greek gods.
The ones who acted like, well, flawed humans.
Precisely. He famously criticized Homer and Hesiod for portraying the gods as thieves, adulterers, and liars. And Xenophanes proposed something different. He said there is one God, greatest among gods and humans, like mortals neither in form nor in thought.
Wow, that sounds much closer to a transcendent, singular God.
It does. He seems to be pushing towards a kind of philosophical monotheism, or maybe monism. And later still, you have Plato talking about the demiurge, the craftsman god who shapes the material world, and Aristotle's concept of the unmoved mover.
The ultimate cause of all motion and change.
Right. These aren't quite the personal, involved God of Abrahamic faiths, but they represent highly influential philosophical concepts of a unitary, ultimate, divine principle. And these ideas definitely fed into later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic theological discussions.
So we've seen these different strands emerging in religious practice, in philosophical thought. How do scholars try to explain the overall emergence of monotheism? Are there theories about how this shift happened?
Yeah, there are a few key ideas, though they've evolved. For a long time, especially within monotheistic traditions themselves, there was this idea of an original monotheism.
Like, humanity started out believing in one God, and then things went wrong.
Sort of, yeah. The idea of an Adamic religion, or what German scholars called religion or monotheismus, a primordial monotheism that later decayed into polytheism. Wilhelm Schmidt was a big proponent of this early in the 20th century.
But that's not the dominant view now.
Not really, no. It's largely been abandoned by mainstream scholarship. The evidence points more towards an evolutionary progression.
Like the model Karen Armstrong discusses.
Exactly. That's a more recent and widely discussed framework. She suggests a possible progression, kind of like starting with animism, belief in spirits inhabiting nature, then developing into polytheism with distinct gods and goddesses, then maybe moving to henotheism, focusing on one god among many,
Right.
then perhaps monolatry, worshiping only one while acknowledging others, and finally arriving at true monotheism, the belief in only one god.
So a gradual narrowing and focusing of belief over time.
That's the idea. It's not necessarily a strict linear path everywhere, but it offers a way to understand how belief systems might have evolved based on historical and anthropological evidence.
Okay, that makes sense as a potential trajectory. And within that final stage, monotheism, we have those different types we talked about, narrow and wide, showing up all over the place.
Absolutely. We can see examples across different regions. In Africa, for instance, the Congo faith among the Congo people, they have Nenzio Mpumutulendo as the supreme creator god.
But it's not just about that one God.
Right. There's also significant respect for ancestral spirits, the community, natural forces acting as intermediaries. That definitely sounds like a wide monotheism.
And other African traditions.
There are ancient beliefs, like Wak among Cushitic speakers, or Ngai for the Maasai people. These often point towards a supreme deity, probably also fitting that wide monotheistic pattern. The Oromo people's Irita festival, dedicated to Wak, is a living example.
And Akhenaten's Atonism, if we count it, would be wide too.
Probably, yeah. Even with the suppression, the focus was elevation, maybe not total denial initially, though some scholars stick to monolatry as the better term there.
What about the Americas? The idea of the Great Spirit comes to mind.
Yes, concepts like Wakantanka among the Lakota or Gitchmanatu among Algonquian peoples often get translated as Great Spirit, implying a supreme unifying force.
So monotheism.
It leans that way, often interpreted as wide monotheism, but it's complex. For the Lakota, for example, Wakantanka was sometimes understood more like a great mystery, or even a council of gods, not necessarily a single entity in the Abrahamic sense. So nuances are important.
And Aztec philosophy. I read something about Tetel.
Right, there are interpretations suggesting Tetel represented a single underlying divine reality, maybe a kind of panentheism or wide monotheism. But there's also criticism that These interpretations might be influenced by post-conquest Christian perspectives trying to find parallels. So it's debated.
Okay, moving over to Asia, such a huge diversity there.
Immense. We touched on Hinduism. It spans everything from monism to polytheism, but with strong currents that fit wide monotheism, like seeing gods as aspects of Brahman, or traditions focusing on Krishna as the ultimate source.
But then you have something like Sikhism.
Sikhism is a very clear example of narrow monotheism. The Mool mantra, the opening creed, emphasizes Ik Onkar, one creator. Belief in one timeless, formless, omnipresent creator God, Akal Purak or Vaheguru, is absolutely central and uncompromising.
No room for lesser deities there.
Not in the same way, no, though some might find monistic interpretations within Sikh thought too. Then China, we saw the early wide form with Shangdi, possibly moving towards narrower ideas with Mohism.
And Central Asia, Tengrism.
Tengrism is fascinating. It features Tengri, the eternal blue sky god, as supreme, but it blends this with shamanism, animism, totemism. It's a mix. So maybe a wide monotheism coexisting with polytheistic and animistic elements.
And then, of course, the big ones that spread globally.
The Abrahamic faiths, yeah.
Yeah.
Judaism, Christianity, Islam. They are the classic examples of narrow monotheism, insisting on the absolute oneness and uniqueness of God.
With core declarations like the Shema in Judaism.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one.
And Tawhid in Islam.
The absolute assertion of God's unity, fundamental to Islam. Also, the Baha'i faith, Mandaism, Rastafari, they all fit within this Abrahamic monotheistic framework.
Although there's sometimes disagreement between them, right? Like how some in Judaism and Islam view Christian Trinitarianism.
That's true. The Christian concept of God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, while understood as one God within Christianity, is sometimes viewed by strict Unitarians in Judaism and Islam as compromising pure monotheism. It's a significant theological point of difference.
And we can't forget Yazidism.
Yazidism is unique. They believe in one God who created the world but then withdrew, leaving governance to 7 angels, primarily Melek Taus, the peacock angel. So a single creator God, but inactive, with intermediaries ruling, a very distinct form, maybe wide monotheism.
And Zoroastrianism, back again.
Right, fitting in Asia too. Wide monotheism seems the best fit, acknowledging Ahura Mazda's supremacy, but with the complexity of lesser divine beings, Yazatas, and that significant dualistic element with Ahriman.
Okay, let's hop over to Europe. Any early signs there?
Well, linguists reconstruct a chief sky god for the Proto-Indo-Europeans, Deus Putar, the ancestor of Zeus, Jupiter, etc. But the overall religion was polytheistic, not monotheistic.
So just a prominent god, not the only one.
Exactly. There are some hints in ancient Slavic religion where the thunder god Perun was sometimes called the only lord, suggesting a possible henotheistic or wide monotheistic tendency for some.
And then the Greek philosophers we mentioned.
Yes, Xenophanes pushing towards a single, non-anthropomorphic god. Later, Neoplatonism with its concept of the one as the ultimate source of all reality, very influential philosophically. And even some later Hellenistic oracles of Apollo apparently proclaimed one highest god over all others.
Interesting. And lastly, Oceania. Anything there?
The sources mention the traditional religion of the Andamanese peoples in the Bay of Bengal. They have a primary deity, Puluga, associated with the sky and creation.
Monotheism.
It's described as having monotheistic elements, but Puluga isn't really the focus of active worship day to day, which revolves more around dealing with various spirits. So again, maybe a kind of wide monotheism or a supreme deity within a broader animistic system.
Wow. Okay, so it really is a global phenomenon, this tendency towards conceptualizing a single ultimate divine reality, even if it plays out in incredibly different ways.
It absolutely is. From the strictest only one exists to one is supreme among others, the idea has manifested all over.
Now, the sources also briefly touch on criticisms of monotheism. We should probably mention that, just for balance.
Yeah. We should, yeah. It's important to note that the concept hasn't been without its critics, historically and philosophically.
Like the idea that it might be less tolerant than polytheism.
That's a common point, raised by thinkers like David Hume. Polytheism, by its nature, often incorporates many gods, potentially making it more open to different beliefs. Monotheism's insistence on one truth can, some argue, lead to intolerance of other faiths.
Jacob Neusner seemed to echo that, saying it offers little basis for tolerance.
Right. Others, like Auguste Comte, questioned how an all-powerful, benevolent single god could be reconciled with the existence of evil, and some contemporary critics, like Jonathan Kershaw, referencing early Israelite history, point to instances where monotheistic fervor seemed linked to violence or exclusion.
There was that quote from Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan.
About intolerance being written in blood. Yes, a strong critique suggesting that exclusive claims to truth can fuel conflict. It's crucial to acknowledge these criticisms exist, presenting them neutrally as part of the discussion around monotheism's impact.
Definitely. So bringing this all together, what's the big takeaway? The journey from believing in many spirits or gods to focusing on a single all-powerful one. It wasn't simple.
Not at all. It was clearly a really complex, multifaceted process. It happened differently across cultures, across time periods. We see early inklings in hymns, philosophical thought experiments.
Right, like whispers of the idea.
Evolving into the more clearly defined monotheistic faiths that shape the world today. This idea of God against the world, a singular divine entity standing apart, it's just profoundly shaped human history. Billions live by it today.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Considering all these diverse paths we've looked at, these different interpretations from wide to narrow, why did the specific idea of strict, exclusive monotheism take such firm root and flourish so powerfully in certain societies, like those influenced by the Abrahamic traditions, while other cultures maintained polytheistic systems or developed different kinds of monistic or wide monotheistic structures?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
What were the catalysts? Was it social upheaval, political consolidation, specific philosophical breakthroughs, or a combination of everything? Understanding that seems key to grasping why our religious world looks the way it does.
Absolutely. Those driving forces behind why one model prevailed in certain contexts over others,
Yeah.
that's a whole other deep dive in itself.
Something for you to think about. Thanks for listening. Write us in the comments your opinion on the episode and what other topics you would like us to talk about. Subscribe to the channel to help us reach more listeners. Thank you, and have an amazing day.